it gives you a chance of understanding what's going on, because otherwise the that sort of gendered soul queer theory stuff, it it doesn't the queer theorists are so against categorization in general that
Mm.
they're not even equipped to tell you what's happening, because that would go against their way of thinking. Um,
Right.
so it's their way of thinking is basically totally pointless and a waste of thinking effort.
Welcome. How do I say your name correctly? I say Phil Illy.
Uh,
We calling you Philly? Like, what
uh,
moniker do you prefer?
Illy, yeah, last name's Illy.
That's ill. That's sick.
Copy. Yeah, it's pretty simple.
All right. So, you actually reached out to me because you saw that I was on Benjamin Boyce and you wanted to talk about a couple things. And
Yeah, you were on Boyce, and it seemed like you thought about the trans stuff a lot, and
oh god,
you
yeah.
know, it seemed like you were pretty good at talking and thinking. So I figured I should reach out.
Yeah, I really do appreciate it because it came right as we were getting permabanned off Twitter, which makes like scheduling interviews so much harder now. Like having to set up other stuff. So you really helped with that in that regard. But yeah, so I looked into some of your stuff. I mean I want to say that I did my research, but I'm not like Hot Ones or anything where I'm going to be like talking about a high school Instagram post you had or something while you're eating a spicy wing, but. Nevertheless, it seemed like you had a really interesting story. This kind of, you're in Portland, you're in a very progressive mindset in life and things like that. And then you kind of have this awakening to what you would describe as, your, auto heterosexuality and sense of self in your sexuality being infused with the love of the we'll say for now, for lack of a better term, without getting too much into esoteric queer theory, kind of the spirit of femininity in some way, embodying that.
Yeah.
And, but then also as someone that's autistic, fighting for truth and trying to actually understand this issue in a space where it seems like no one is actually trying to understand the issue. Everyone just has preconceived notions and battle lines in the sand based upon ideology. And it seems like you're kind of a brave individual standing up with the unpopular opinion that like, no, you right wingers are crazy and you TRAs are crazy. Can we please just look at the fucking science here and see like what the science is teaching us? And it's a fascinating story. So I'd really love to dig into it and also just kind of discuss some of the back and forth, like your opinions, my opinions, and how we view that both politically, ideologically, and also the science behind it. I'm super excited to have this conversation. So with that being said, please, who are you and why are you here?
I'm Phil Illy. I'm here because I'm trying to get the word out about a book I wrote. I wrote a science book about autoheterosexuality, which is when you're attracted to being the other sex. And yeah, like you said when you were talking about my backstory, I found out about this pretty late in life, and I wanted to know what was real because that mattered to me. And so I looked into the science, and it seemed like it was pretty solid. And the theory seemed to predict experiences that I'd had, and also, I'd like tried various things I'd never thought of before just based on the theory, and it's like, yep, that theory, it seems to be true. So basically it had predictive power, and it just seemed like it was true. And I didn't like, it bothered me that for me to go along with the mainstream ideas about gender stuff, I'd have to lie. And I didn't think that was fair, that I'd have to lie. So I'd rather be accurate and honest. And so that's what I'm trying to do.
So there are two predominant theories, I would say, two camps of ideology, ideologically driven theories. There is the kind of the radical feminist turf camp that conservatives have kind of, for lack of having any philosophical position, have kind of like adopted, I would say, which is this idea that like there is no such thing as gender roles and gender for hundreds and thousands of years. Sex and gender were the same thing. A man is a man, a woman is a woman is an adult human female. To call it anything else is absurdity. And, and to talk about sexual orientation or way you express yourself is insane. And then there's the queer theorist idea, which is, you have a Gnostic understanding, belief within yourself of who your spirit, your gender is. No one can tell you or invalidate that as wrong in any way, shape, or form. And to do so is to oppress you and to make you part of an oppressed group that is, under the thumb of cis heteronormativity and patriarchy. And, but you present, along with others, you discovered and kind of further a new path, a new vision of kind of what the fuck is going on with this cohort of people that are embroiled in the culture war. And I was curious, you said, I discovered this, it's with the truth. Like, can we maybe get I think most people are familiar with those two camps. Can we get a detailed explanation of what this is?
Oh, yeah, basically. So, yeah, the sexologists in the 70s were sort of honing in on this idea that transsexualism was that transsexuals came from one of two groups, with male and female transsexuals, that they were either homosexuals or they were transvestites. And in the 80s, Blanchard did a bunch of work at a gender clinic up in Toronto, Ray Blanchard, and he did some typology studies because they were trying to figure out how many types there were. And eventually he settled on the fact that there's a homosexual type of transgenderism that tends to arise earlier in life and be connected with innate gender nonconformity. And this type, when they transition, it can be a big social win in a lot of ways. They go from being standing out to really fitting into heteronormative society pretty well. And the other type he called autogynephilic, which means the love of self as woman. And that's people who are sexually attracted to being a woman. It's basically what happens when sexual orientation gets pointed at yourself instead of other people. And so he came up with this two-type typology of male to female transsexualism. And in my book, I argue that applies to both sexes, that because there's reports in the sexology literature of females that are autoandrophilic, they love the man inside of them. And when I look at, transsexual men talk online, the FTMs, the overall structure of their thinking and way of thinking is pretty similar with what they care about, but, they may be a little more, maybe different in sex typical ways, maybe more female typical type thinking compared to the autogynephiles. But basically it seems like there's, so I just realized that Blanchard's typology of male to female transsexualism could probably be extended, and I needed a term for the thing that female autoandrophilia and male autogynephilia, what they had in common. And what they had in common is that they're the autosexual version of heterosexuality, and so that's why I call it autoheterosexual.
Yeah, so just to make things clear for everybody listening, because when you hear it the first time, it can be so confusing. But when you hear andro, you're talking man. When you hear gyno, you're talking female. When you hear auto, you're talking self. When you hear allo, you're talking about the other, pair bonding with another individual, right? And obviously, sexuality gets added in, and we understand that we're talking about, theoretically or hypothetically, I should say, we're talking about a sexual orientation, combining these words to accurately describe what that sexual orientation is. So, an allo heterosexual is someone that is, cis heteronormative, right? That's your normal, for lack of a better word, your normative ideas that you are a heterosexual and your heterosexuality is focused on the other, right? I am a man that is really attracted to women, that is that allo. So I know, like, you start hearing all these words going around and people are like, wait, what is what? Just know that when we hear gyno, we're talking woman, andro, we're talking man, allo is the other, auto is the self. Which I think
That
is
was a
a
good
really
way of
interesting,
clearing it up. Yeah.
which I think is, it is a really interesting thing. You know, I think there is even more complexity, like when we look at Blanchard and, you know, we recognize that there is the kind of the four levels of engaged play with the role, right? At least maybe, hold on, maybe I should explain how I define woman, right? And I think maybe that helps understand where I'm coming from with this. You know, I would say that a woman is the socially constructed gender role that is inherent to the adult human female, right? I would say that role describes the adult human female, the roles, behavior, what society says about dress and things like that. That is what it's describing. And other people can play and potentially inherit that role to a degree, but not being the thing that it's describing. That is exactly what I feel like you're doing is playing that role a little bit, or embodying that role in some degree. And so I'm trying to understand this better. Well, I guess before I go further, like, how do you feel about that? Like, how do you find yourself in this position where gender is a role, or when you talk about switching, right? When you talk about embodying, do you feel that it is something more than that? You have some leanings towards the kind of the queer theorist idea of like the spirit of gender, the knowledge of gender that's different.
I generally, I define gender as sexness. That basically, femaleness is femininity, you know, that's gender,
Mm-hmm.
and maleness is masculinity, and that's the masculine gender. And so that means that gender is sexness. And it's basically, you know, the qualities of being a particular sex, or the condition of being a particular sex. It's the isness of sex, but it's not sex itself. And so, yeah, when say like I or other auto-heterosexuals do various forms of cross-gender embodiment, like it obviously doesn't make us literally the other sex, but it sort of like symbolically evokes the idea of being that, and of being like the other sex. And
Yeah, it sounds like
yeah,
we're saying kind of the same thing, just a different way, right?
yeah, but yeah, if I were to give like a one word definition of gender, it is sexness.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's a probably easier, but maybe it requires more explanation, whereas mine is less easy. I don't know. I like your definition. It's all right. It's nice and it's curt. I
Yeah, I try
appreciate
to
that.
minimize syllables and words to make it the message as
I
straightforward as possible.
haven't gotten a copy of your book yet, but I've heard that you do that in the text as well. That you tried to the best of your ability to like really try and not expound into like this big narrative form as much as possible, but really just kind of try and accurately describe the issues.
Right, and you wouldn't guess that based on the page count, but it really is very straight talk in the book. And I tried to remove fluff wherever possible. If I could remove a word, I did. If I could shorten a word, I did. That sort of thing.
So if so one of the things that I come across, right, which is like, it sounds really cool, right? And this is someone that isn't probably as familiar with the research as you are. So I guess what I want is if you could maybe expound or tell me why my intuition is right. Because my intuition when I come across this is a really, really good way to describe, you know, a feeling that rings true for a lot of people. This this idea of being attracted to the self. I think it helps explain some of the extreme levels of narcissism within the trans community, if you will, right? That self-love might tend towards that. But the problem is that there's this typology, right, between the auto-heterosexual and the homosexual transgender. And I maybe I'm just unfamiliar with the research, but I haven't seen anything that really shows how these are so substantively different in outcomes, the way they engage in the world, what they do in such a way that makes this distinction so important. Like, what am I missing when I have that intuition? And I don't seem to find that research immediately, that your book is going to tell me how wrong I am.
Oh, no, there's something to that basically if someone is gender dysphoric to a significant degree, that they would benefit from gender transition to some extent. It doesn't matter too much where the actual cause of that dysphoria, because the treatment of getting hormones and surgery is fundamentally the same as far as what the medical establishment can give you. But I think it's important to know the distinction, because for the people that have this dysphoria, I think it can help them suffer less if they understand where it's coming from. Because if they have a model of how it tends to work, they can actually sort of start being able to see it in real time, like, oh, this is what's happening right now, and maybe not experience the emotions as intensely, the dysphoria when it comes up, to be like, oh, that's just like a trick of my mind or something like that. It's mostly to help the people that have the dysphoria be able to make more informed decisions about whether they would benefit from gender transition.
So it's almost like, sorry, I'm playing with toothpicks. I'm quitting vaping, nicotine and vaping. So
It's a hard
lot of
quit. It's
toothpicks.
hard to quit that. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, so it almost seems like, when we look at kind of how I described, there's these two major camps of philosophy, right? Apart from this third way that Blanchard and people are putting forward that kind of, mostly upsets the TRAs, and WPATH and DSM apparently as well. But nevertheless, what happens if you are the trans person is, you have a genuine sense of dysphoria. You don't necessarily understand where it comes from. And you go to a gender clinic or a counselor, and a counselor is terrified of losing their license. And so they kind of just go with whatever APA recommends, right? Which is like, oh, you know yourself. This is your identity. Here's hormone replacement therapy. We're going to get you in book with an endocrinologist, and then you are no longer my problem, right? And so you're left with this person that it seems like the dominant philosophy is all about oppression, critical theory, the patriarchy, the heteronormativity, and like its answers for what's going on with you and your dysphoria is, oh, you just have a gendered soul, and once you match that gendered soul, everything will be great. Except the research shows that like passing isn't the most amazing thing in the world, right? It doesn't have a massive increase on suicidality. It doesn't have a massive increase. Comes with all kinds of other issues. And what you're saying is this allows you presently in the day to day to be able to understand when you have those dysphoric moments or those euphoric moments, to actually understand what's going on and live and be comfortable with who you are and be able to kind of like engage with yourself as an individual in a way that the other theories just simply don't.
Exactly. Yeah, it gives you a chance of understanding what's going on, because otherwise that sort of gendered soul queer theory stuff, it doesn't, the queer theorists are so against categorization in general that they're not even equipped to tell you what's happening, because that would go against their way of thinking.
Right.
So their way of thinking is basically totally pointless and a waste of thinking effort. And this sort of meplex I'm putting out there, it can replace the gender ideology, because it offers an alternative framework for understanding transgenderism, gender dysphoria. Yeah, so it has a chance of replacing the gender religion with gender science instead.
So it is, I'm looking at it, it's a very interesting typology. And I think it might be true, right? Which I think because it has far more utility than anything anybody else is putting. I mean, I'm so sick of hearing the TERFs just be like, do away with gender. Like, gender's here to stay. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
It's not going to happen. Built into us.
It's who we are. Like, and they're like, well, in the 1800s, they didn't used to have gender. It's like, you mean like when widows were like shunned and had to go teach kids at the orphanage because they didn't have a man attached to them. Like, yeah, like there used to be really strict gender roles to the point where there was no differentiation between gender and sex because you're a female, this is what you fucking do. Right? It's like, no, man, we live in a liberal society. They're here to stay. But I guess my question is does this typology, how do you allay the concerns of the conservative, right? That looks at this and says, well, aren't you just normalizing mental health disorders and paraphilic disorders?
Well, I'd probably appeal to their understanding of heterosexuality, that they understand that their heterosexuality structures how they live their life, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a source of meaning and direction that guides how they build their life and what they care about. And I would say that this autosexual version of that has a similar impact in its ability to provide meaning and direction, you know, emotionally. And since it is basically just a relationship between you and yourself, it's not necessarily unethical to act upon it. It's really, you know, we can argue about like which ways of acting upon it are okay or what society's responsibility is, but you know, there's plenty of ways of acting upon it that you can't stop it. You know, like you know, from like say like a libertarian perspective, you wouldn't want to police how whether someone wears men's or women's clothing. You know, so
Yeah, I don't care what, you know, I'm as a libertarian, I come at this politically very differently than most of the people on my side of the culture
yeah,
because of that very reason. You know what I mean? Like, I don't care if you have a women's bath house that lets trans women in there, so long as, you know, the people that go and use that facility know that's what the deal is. You know what I mean? I don't care what the private property owner does. And I also don't care if one discriminates against trans men because I don't know, because you're in a bathhouse and your 8-year-old daughter doesn't want to see a penis. Like, you know what I mean? Like, whatever it is that you choose, you know, that should be up to the private property owner, and what you do with your body should be your own goddamn business. It gets weird once we start talking about kids. That's really where I start ending up lock and step with the conservatives in a lot of ways, because I don't think they're consenting. I think there's a lot of child abuse.
yeah. Like I have some wariness about the child transition, but it's not so clear to me. Like I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I do think that it would be a step in the right direction if people understood if their kid was having gender issues, like if they understood which of the two types they have, you know, or if they didn't have one of those two types, they would realize, hey, this isn't actually a legitimate case of gender dysphoria and transition should just be off the table, you know? So, yeah, I just think it would improve outcomes if people understood what they were doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's you know, I would surmise that, you know, as a strict libertarian, I'm very deontological in the way I view morality. It's either right or wrong. You know what I mean? I don't really care about the consequences. But this is probably an area where, to at least some degree, we line up because the data is so sparse. And one of the things that I think upsets me the most about the data on these issues is that this is literally the easiest population in the world to research. And it's like there's no excuse for the lack of data, the lack of research, the lack of science, because it's one of the only populations in the world where if you want to fully transition, at least, you know, at least those that are committed to the transition, maybe not the auto-heterosexual individual that chooses to stay within their own, you know, body. That might be more difficult to find and capture. But at least of those that take HRT, androgen therapy, there's no other demographic that like is forced to go to a place with psychologists. You know, like it is the easiest thing to get to study. Like it, and yet we just don't do it because so many people are terrified of doing that data, and there already is an ideological explanation for all of these things that supersedes any desire to gain additional information that could actually help people and save lives.
Right. Yeah, no, the transgender research situation is pretty awful right now where researchers like truth seeking researchers, like there's a lot of incentives to have them not actually do studies, and it leaves it so that all the ideologically motivated like researchers are they're the only ones publishing studies for the most part, and the conclusion is going to be clear ahead of time, and it's it just really worries me that they're acting under an ideological they have ideological motivations, but they're like pretending to do science, and they've captured the institutions and sort of instituted this orthodoxy, but they don't actually even know the basics of like, hey, this is two fundamentally different conditions we're talking about here. First of all, and
Right.
and this, so the studies aren't even like splitting the participants up into two different groups, and so you're getting a bunch of data that's like not finding any clear signals because it's mixing together two fundamentally different conditions under one heading, and it's the research in general is pretty awful on it, and then the reference
That's always been.
materials.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say the reference materials based on that research, like the WPATH standards of care and the DSM, like a lot of they're pretty bad because activists have progressively captured those organizations more and more, and so the clinicians can't even get good reference documents to begin to understand what they're dealing with.
Yeah, that has always been such a huge thing to me is, apart just from switching, breaking down participants based off of, the different forms of sexuality in this typology, you've kind of expanded on, right? But also the personality disorders, right? What has really upset me about almost all of the research is that very often the research on what is effective for trans people is we're going to take a select group of people. We're not going to break them up by anything other than ethnicity and age, which are, sure, they're important, but like they're nowhere near as important as sexuality and whether or not they have comorbid personality disorders or like other severe mental health disorders, right? Like those are way more important to understand the effectiveness of transition. And then they'll take these people and there'll be people that see an endocrinologist that manages their hormone replacement, right? And then be like, look at this is what hormone replacement therapy does. And it's like, well, number one, can you show me the difference between the people that have NPD and the people that don't have a personality? Number two, can you show me the different sexualities? And then also number three, like the majority of trans people in the United States are not taking the same prescription that they were given from the endo, right? Like I think it's like 57% are under prescribed or under medicating because of insurance reasons, and then like a quarter of them are getting multiple sources of estradiol or progesterone, or the male to females take a myriad, right? Like for women it's usually just like, here's some testosterone, have at it. But but you know what I'm saying? And so like, it is really a tragedy. What do you hypothesize would be a significant difference in a lot of these research outcomes if they were separated by sexuality? Do you think that there would be, I mean, what do you think, what do you think it would show for those cohorts in terms of the science? If you had to guess.
I think that the autoheterosexuals would be the ones that benefit from it more because they directly want what transition is offering to them. Like, whereas the homosexual ones, like, they're not, it's like an indirect treatment for what they have. It's, like transition, it's not like they like literally are attracted to being the other sex and get like feel better about themselves in the same way from looking like the other sex. I guess, I just think the autoheterosexuals would benefit more. And this is partially because when I look at the prevalence of the sexual orientations that lead to transgenderism in the population, and then look at the ideological breakdown of the transgender community itself, even though like within each sex, like autoheterosexuality and homosexuality are like roughly as common, but it's in the US, like 3 out of 4 transgender people are of the autoheterosexual ideology. So, it's way more of them are making the decision to transition, like of all ages. So like I'm kind of trusting their aggregate decision making, that like it clearly seems that basically more of them are making the decision to transition. And so it seems that that it benefits them more.
I mean, counterpoint for you to talk about. Could it also not be the trenders and the ideological push towards being a special victim of a special elevated status, if one leans into that idea of transition, or even possibly environmental pressure that morphs that sexuality in some degree? Because if there is a significant difference, is it, like, where is that coming from? It could be on the flip side, it could be that, right?
If it was this sort of like socially mediated social contagion sort of thing, the rapid onset thing, it's hard to know because researchers haven't yet done studies where they aggressively try to classify the participants to know how many are autoheterosexual, particularly among females. Like they've done very little research into female autoandrophilia and, how to find it, like what sort of questions to ask them. Like this is still not known. And so it's hard to say how many of these are due to social contagion. I do think there is a very real effect from the sort of the gender religion that's been popular in the last 10 years. It does make transition seem like it offers more, because when you place more emphasis on gender instead of sex, then the prospect of changing your gender is a much more impactful thing.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's leading to more people transitioning of probably both ideologies and in both sexes. And I guess I want
to say that I think it's important that we maybe, at least for me, maybe that we separate this idea of social contagion into two categories, because there's kind of two different types of social contagion. And so from like a clinical perspective, social contagion is usually young girls, prepubescent, early puberty girls who hormones get out of whack and they have a shit ton of negative emotion. And they're trying to like kind of figure out what to do with all of that negative emotion, all that anxiety, sadness, rage, whatever, all of these kind of negative feelings, which human females have for one reason or another, probably for childhood, nevertheless. Also potentially just because they're weaker physically than males. And, it's good to be able to read anger on someone else's face if you're a female, and you might get, beat by the caveman. But regardless, and so what ends up happening is, whilst you're in that exploration age of your own negative emotion, something bad happens. We see this with anorexia. We see this with, suicides. And we see this as well with, schools where one person becomes non-binary, etc. And so the females in the area tend to latch onto it. And I think that's a very specific age range thing that has very specific reasons, that is different than kind of just the overall moving toward like the political, critical, queer theory. I'm kind of in this progressive camp, take my kids to drag, kind of like ideological shift that like makes this seem like a good thing. Because I think one, that with the girls can be something that might create, like might predate upon those girls. Take people that don't actually have any sexual orientation or ideology or any inkling towards that, and actually like groom them in a capacity when combined. Whereas I think just the societal shift probably just brings people that have those tendencies into accepting and or choosing to transition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Something, yeah, about like the young girls that are transitioning. It's hard to know how many of them have that sort of social contagion,
Mm-hmm.
and how many of them are autoandrophilic, because like even like Lisa Littman's study,
Mm-hmm.
she didn't ask the parents to like about signs that their kid was autoandrophilic or autogynephilic, like they didn't investigate that. um and so it's hard to say. I mean, it is worrying because historically that transsexualism did lean heavily male, maybe like 3 times as many were male, and now the ratio
It's the
has
opposite.
flipped. Yeah, it's getting pretty intensely leaning female. um but yeah, it's hard to say how much of this is just that we're finally meeting a demand that was always there but latent and people didn't have the words for it, and like how
Mm-hmm.
much of it is like an artificially created demand.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, for example, like back in like late 80s, Lou Sullivan, a gay trans man, he was autoandrophilic, and he was searching through the literature for others like him, ones that were like just attracted to men, and he couldn't find any. And he reached out to sexologists, and they wrote case reports on him, and he got the word out that like you could be a trans man and attracted to men. And after that sort of transition started going up, you know and like I think part of that is just that people had some examples to follow where they're like, oh, that's not just me that feels that way, it's a real thing, it's not just in my
Mm-hmm.
mind. And so I'm wondering if what's happening now is maybe not just a bigger version of that, where we have this
So
sort of
do
like
you feel
gender
like,
blue that's taught in schools, and now girls like just want to be boys more often.
yeah, I guess my question is, do you still view auto homosexuality, right? So auto and androphilic for females, auto gynephilic for, for males, as like an important distinction in typology, because it is something that we can look at both from a counseling perspective, life coach perspective, etc. Um, as like we can explain, and like the other as kind of like more in the domain of the unknown, and that like it's important to recognize that these two things are different, because we're not going to understand either until we recognize that these things are different, and that putting them into the same category because the physical kind of phenotypic result is the same. Give me the antigen therapy, give me the HRT, give me the sex reassignment surgery, etc. But like we're talking about two different people, and like, hey, for one group of people, the autoheterosexuals, this is going to help you understand yourself more. And for the other group, it's important that we recognize that they're an other group so we can have better data and understanding of
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
going forward, like what the fuck is this whole thing we're doing?
Right. Yeah. Until we start separating into the separate groups, we're not going to find out, if there's maybe a third type, or
Mm-hmm.
if that third type is just an illusion, So,
Right.
like,
Well, I mean, like,
yeah.
see, this is my thought process, right? Is like if we do a p-value study of 1,000 people, random control trial, and we separate auto heterosexual versus auto homosexual, and we follow outcomes, it's my hypothesis, for whatever ignorant that it is, that you're going to find that the auto homosexuals,
They're just
are not
regular
going to be improved.
homosexuals.
That they're not going to be improved by the transition process. So that suicidality is going to be not statistically significantly. And then I think the other category is going to be more greatly improved than the research currently shows, because they're being grouped with people that I don't think it's as effective.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a pretty good guess. Like I said, the homosexuals are not transitioning as often. And when I look at the people in the trans movement that are the most passionate about kids having access to transition,
Mm-hmm.
it's not the ones that I mentally categorize as the homosexual type. It's the autogynephilic trans women and the autoandrophilic trans men that are really pushing for it.
Yeah, I mean, so my position has always been this, which is, unlike the conservatives, I don't want to ban transition, gender affirming care, trans therapy for minors. What I want to do is I want the individuals that do this to have the burden of proof when that person is a detrans person as an adult, that they did an insane amount of work to determine that this had to be the best thing. Like, what I want is, I want lawfare. Like, I want clinics that are just handing out HRT like it's fucking candy to be sued out of existence. But I do recognize that there are a select group of people that in our society that would benefit from this. And what we know is, maybe not physically, because there's always the physical harm from antigen, GRNH therapy, and HRT. That physical harm's always there. But psychologically, kind of the earlier the better for a lot of these people. And waiting until you're 19 or 20, I refuse to use the TRA idea that this is somehow a death sentence. But it is certainly going to lead to better outcomes if you don't develop through an entire puberty of a gender
Right.
that you don't want to present as an adult.
Yeah, and I think that's more relevant for the male to females, the urgency with puberty blocking and such, because masculinization is kind of a one-way trip, and it's hard to undo that. Whereas, a lot of the trans men pass perfectly well, because you see someone with like a fairly deep voice and facial hair, and you're like, yep, like you just instantly think that's probably a man, But it's
yeah, I mean, the
harder.
voice can tend to give it away, some of the behaviors and things like that. But yeah, I mean, like, there's always a little inkling. I actually find that it's like a for lack of a better word, it's like IQ, right? Whereas like men tend more towards the extremes and women tend more towards the center, right? So men and women have the same IQ average, but like if you go to the ends of the distribution, it's men. I think the same thing is true with male to female and female to male. Whereas like there are some biological males that, end in the doll category that get to a point where it's like you would have no fucking clue. Whereas with female to males, there's always kind of an inkling. But on the average, I agree with you that female to male tend to pass in society fairly well, where there are a lot of disaffected biological males that attempt to pass. And it is only the collective narcissism of the trans community and gaslighting each other that makes them think in any way that they passed. Like you see these people that are like, I'm no offense, my guy, but you're clocked a mile away. And you're like, I'm sexier than your wife. And you're like, what is wrong with this person? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, they do. The trans community, they're not doing the best at being honest with each other about passing. And, it makes sense. They have their heart set on, looking like the other sex. And it just means a lot to them. And so I'm not surprised that they sort of like collectively delude each other about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is unfortunate, because then people have unrealistic ideas about what is feasible for them in terms of transition, if they care about passing.
Well, it's kind of a limitation of current technology. Like it's kind of similar to the abortion issue, whereas like pretty soon we can just make abortions illegal forever and no one will care, because we'll have artificial wombs and you can just kind of snip it out, put it in a different womb, and you're done. Your responsibility is done, and the baby doesn't actually die. It's kind of the same thing, I think, with passing, right? And I don't know how long it's going to take, but 30 years, maybe 40 years, you're going to be able to tell the fucking difference if someone has the money to get the surgeries.
Right. Yeah. It's. You mean like once technology advances, it'll be harder to tell?
Yeah, I think every year we're getting to a point where people, a larger percentage of people are successfully passing simply because facial feminization surgery 10, 15 years ago was a really difficult thing to do, and it usually just involved a nose job. But now it's a pretty benign procedure to get your jaw shaved, to get your nose done, and to get your cheekbones moved and buccal fat removal, kind of all in one surgery, one stop and shop, boom, and they just call it feminization. That's a huge difference in the last, decade.
Yeah. There's a lot more surgeons. They've gotten a lot more practice because of the increase in transition, and so naturally the technology and methods are getting better.
Mm-hmm.
I still think though that that can't make someone shorter, or I mean, there is a surgery to make people's shoulders narrower, but that one's, as far as I could tell, pretty brutal, and I definitely don't recommend it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's things you can do with surgeries, but there's definitely diminishing returns, and there's some people that no matter what the surgery situation is, they don't have a chance of passing.
Yeah, I mean, you and I you're 6'4", correct?
Right, yeah.
And I'm
taller,
6'5",
yeah.
right? Like the two of us, like, no matter how deep our desire to be the embodiment of femininity, when we walk into a room, we're usually the tallest person in the room.
Yeah,
it's not going to work in high heels.
Right, exactly. And so we're a height where we're taller than the average male to the same degree that men are taller than the average women, Like the sex difference between the sexes, like if there was like a third sex that was, even manlier than men, like that, we'd be that height.
I'm not male or female. I'm giant.
Yeah, I'm not male or female. I'm Giga Chad. Yeah.
I am Nephilim gender. Please respect my giant DNA. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I get that. I guess this conversation has kind of bounced around because it's really interesting, and there's so many different ways you can take this. And I don't know, kind of, I guess, to get it back on track a little bit. Is there understanding this, do you feel that there is kind of this idea that transition, to me, I don't want to call it cowardice, right? I don't want to call it cowardly to transition with hormones and things like that. But there does seem to be a kind of a desperation that's both sold to trans people, and that is within the trans person to kind of not deal with this, right? Like to kind of put the problem into my body doesn't match the internal kind of feeling that I have. And so fuck it. I will do everything I can to focus on changing my body, and everything will be great once my body is changed. And so I almost wonder, do you think higher recognition of auto-heterosexuality might actually eventually lead towards less unnecessary transitions and sterilizations and things, because there's an acceptance and understanding of what you are, and that doesn't require you to run from it by getting surgeries and hormones?
It's actually highly individual, because like there'll be people that once they find out what it is, they'll wish they didn't transition it and they dealt with it another way. And there are also people that find out and realize that their attempts to repress or just stop it were foolish, because you can't logic your way out of a sexual orientation. And so it's highly individual based on the person. But I do hope that once auto-heterosexuals understand their orientation better on average, that they'll be able to not only guess for themselves whether transition will benefit them, but also be able to, tell from observing their own, others like them transition and see their outcomes.
So, I guess at a certain point, I'm all for the freedom of the individual to do whatever they do. So I don't really necessarily have this doomer version that if somebody wants to fucking self-select themselves out of the gene pool, that like that's somehow inherently evil or something. I'm not necessarily, so like if someone wants to go through that process, like more power to them. There's plenty of adopted kids that should go ahead and get adopted. But
right.
But I do feel like there is something there, right? There is something there that I think will kind of always be in opposition, right? Because there is a kind of an almost moral drive from most humans, especially for the right-wing variety, that like or life growing, that there will be that it's problematic in its own existence. So like, how do you feel about that? I mean, maybe it's a bit of an aside. I don't know. How do you feel about
it? You cut out for a few seconds there, and I couldn't. I missed.
I'm sorry.
Could you repeat some of it?
Yeah. So I just mean to say that, like, you know, your response to the idea that that this greater understanding might lead towards less or more, it doesn't really matter, in terms of transitioning and sterilization, kind of leads me into this position where not necessarily you or I, but a lot of conservatives, a lot of people are always going to be deeply, deeply against something that is anti-life affirming or growing, which is to say sterilizing.
Right.
Like how do we view or deal with that in terms of, like, do you just think, well, they're wrong, like people should be free? Like what is your response to that? The idea that if it's anti-life, is it good?
I generally lean towards thinking that, you know, if it's an adult, they should be able to do it. And even I get that sort of that fear that it's anti-life. You know, basically our genes in general don't want us to not reproduce. Like I get that impulse against, you know, taking hormones that sterilize you. But something to consider also is that this population does have a much higher rate of mental health disorders, and it's like, it seems to be inborn, you know? And so there's also an argument that if...
Do you really think that,
more,
though?
Yeah, I think I tends to lead towards hereditarianism. But yeah, there's various psychological conditions that trans people have at very elevated rates. You know, like autism, ADHD.
Yeah.
You know, various personality disorders that are highly heritable. You know, like autism, for instance, is roughly like 80% heritable. And so it just, if this population does have a higher rate of mental disorders that lead to suffering, wouldn't it progressively reduce suffering over time if, you know, this population reduced less often?
I mean, it depends on the heritability, right? Like autism is really heritable, but also another major cause of the likelihood of autism, age of parent involved, right? So long as women are getting older and older and still having children, we're going to see increased rates of autism, right? Like that's just, we're going to see more and more autism the more women over 35 keep having children, right? So so it's like, I don't know that would necessarily go away. The thing is, because we're talking about these comorbidities first and foremost, right? So the comorbidity of that, personality disorders are tricky because, yes, personality disorders are heritable, right? But a lot of those come from trauma and abuse, right? Like a lot of those are created by inappropriate signals from the parents in terms of emotional responses to different triggers and outcomes, and especially more prevalent in when you only have one parental figure, because it becomes even more difficult to judge appropriate emotional responses and things like that. But then there are people like me, right? My stepfather is a narcissist, and my mother, until recently, traded as borderline personality disorder. I turned out okay. Like, I'm crazy in some ways, but like I'm not like a full-blown narc or anything, you know? So then there's the mental resilience factor that's kind of like an unknown variable in this whole equation. So I think the whole thing is a lot more complicated than what we can do. I do agree, though, that more information that is accurate can't possibly cause more harm, right? It can't possibly be harmful to search for the truth and gain more of that truth and have more accurate information in dealing with and understanding this population. I don't buy the idea, though, that this sexuality is I could buy the idea that it's predominantly heritable, but that it's more than 70-80%. I don't necessarily buy that. Right? Like we have research
Right, yeah,
that shows
I don't know
that
yet.
lesbian couples. Yeah. I don't know. You're right. I don't know. But like I would be incredibly shocked to find that this was like 90% or more heritable. I would say that there is the way that I have always viewed sexuality, that sex research seemed, or sexologists, whatever you want to say, right? Like have seemed to have confirmed over time, is that there is a nature and nurture element to it, and that there's a certain kind of fluidity to it in a spectrum, and that you can only be pushed so far in one direction. If you imagine kind of like heterosexual, homosexual, right? And maybe a couple other different forms of sexuality, that like women tend to be a little bit more fluid, men tend to be a little bit more rigid, and like kind of you're born somewhere in here, and environment can shift you a little bit in one direction or the other. And I know that's kind of like a mental map and not necessarily a scientific thing, but it seems to be that that's how research is kind of always shown it as consistently shown it to be.
With my
And
perception
so,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, I think there's some kids, like, that you see them and you're like, that kid's gay. And people are like, you can't say that about a 6-year-old. And like the conservatives get so mad. And it's like,
Wrong.
No,
You can.
I can. There's some, it's rare, but there's some kids, it's like, this kid is frolicking. Like this kid is like playing with his dolls. Like this kid is obsessed with dress up. This kid plays mommy, like plays mommy in the kitchen, like, as a child, like everything about this kid just exudes like this kind of femininity embodied in them before they ever touch sexuality. And so it's like, there's like, that kid's not cis heteronormative, like even as a young kid, and people get mad and like, they'll say like, you're sexualizing children. No, I'm not. I'm just looking at fucking reality and being like, I've had this experience, and you're lying if you're saying you haven't had this experience too.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm glad you agree about that. Though, like basically you can sometimes tell with some kids if they're going to grow up to be homosexual, because it's, I mean, it doesn't sound very sciencey, but like the vibes, like it's
there's just a vibe, like my kids, my own kids, right? Like I'm very careful. I don't want to say very careful, but I'm pretty careful about like not pushing a gendered ideology onto my kids, right? I want my kids to be whoever my kids are going to be, and I want them to be able to express who they themselves are. The thing I want to push on them is like healthy boundaries, not fucking, this is what a gender role says you're supposed to do. And despite all of that, right? My son is like, he's autistic, and he just like, he climbs and destroys things. And my daughter is like, how do I use my femininity to not get in trouble when I get caught doing something bad, and like loves dress up? Like you could not make a more gendered, like, like a traditional male and female in their behavior. I haven't pushed that shit on them at all. But like, yeah, like I've seen some kids, especially with boys, where it's maybe more apparent, where you're like, oh yeah, you're gonna, it's okay. You're gonna do show choir like I did. It's all right. It's fine.
Yeah. And I'll say like, yeah, if your boy is autistic, and he develops gender issues at some point after puberty, like it just so you know, it'd be the autogynephilic type. Just giving you the heads up on that.
Yo, don't wish that on me just yet.
I'm not wishing. It's pretty common in the autistic population, so I wanted to preemptively mention that.
Yeah, I don't know. See, the way that I view it, and maybe I'm psychopathologizing it a little bit too much, right? But the way that I see it is, it's very interesting to me that the individuals that end up transing themselves in some capacity, right, are obsessive compulsive individuals, OCD, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, so OCPD, and autism. It's very interesting to me that the people that have fixation disorders fixate upon this thing in terms of transitioning, and it very often, it's super concerning to me that these are your two predominant people in terms of transing in because to me that's a very big red flag that there are other factors here that are untreated. And because why is it that the individuals that have fixation disorders are the ones that are fixating on going through this process and other people aren't? You know what I mean? Because like we are talking about an other thing, right? We're talking about either this other sexuality or this other thing. And so to me, it's a huge red flag when fixation disorders are the predominant individuals that are going through all of these medical trends things, because it shows to me a lack of psychological care in what's going on. It shows to me an overabundance in that regard.
Yeah, it's hard to say because like the orientation itself kind of reinforces thinking about gender. Like it makes it seem like it matters more and sort of directs your thoughts in that way. And then so I could see like if it combined with OCD on top of that, I could see why people get routed into this sort of looping way of thinking that progressively makes them commit more and more to that cross-gender path.
But I mean, but to add to that, there's another layer to add to that, right? Which is that every counselor, every psychotherapist, every doctor, everyone within the field that is working within the system that hasn't already told the system to go fuck off and become like a Christian life coach or something, right? Is of the mind that the appropriate care is all of your problems will be better if you get gender affirming care, if we affirm your identity, and if you go through a process, and if you have any distress, it's not your OCD, it's not your depression, it's not, you know, other factors in your life. It is the dysphoria caused by your internal self not matching, you know, the idealized feminine or masculine thing. And so it's like, to me, it seems like they're mapping on and taking advantage of people with obsessive issues because an ideology is controlling the mental health as opposed to mental health care. Like mental health care should be 20 sessions. Figure out who the fuck you are, and then we can maybe start slowly talking about what might be good for you, what your individual challenges are. It's not a one size fits all, come see me once I have the answer. That's always pseudoscience.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely concerned with how clinicians don't do their gatekeeping job anymore. Like, I'm not saying that they should gatekeep as much as they used to, but the fact that so many are just not doing it at all these days means that the patients themselves have to play that role. And yeah, they're not equipped to do that because
14-year-olds don't know how to do that. Yeah.
No, and not when they like were raised in a school where they learned the goddamn like gender unicorn and genderbread person and stuff. So and they're not taught in sex ed that like, hey, there's these two fundamentally different types of trans, like both are okay, but like here's what they are. You know, like sex ed doesn't do that yet. So
is that a major goal that you have?
Yeah, that's sort of like an end policy goal of getting it inserted into the sex ed curriculum, because, you know, at an age appropriate level, it doesn't need to be crude. You know, just in the same way you can teach about bisexuality or homosexuality in like a tasteful, sort of simple way that gives the gist, you can do the same thing for autoheterosexuality. And it would make it so that when kids start experiencing those feelings, you know, especially around puberty when it tends to ramp up, they could realize, they could pattern match and be like, oh, this thing that I'm experiencing, I learned about this and I know the word for it and I can look it up, you know?
I mean, God, that's such a hornet's nest of like, what happens then? You know what I mean? Like, you know, I want, like, if it's true, then one ought teach truth, right? But I don't want to say that you're just guessing. I don't want to say you're guessing, right? Because, you know, when I looked into autogynephilia, you know, it seemed to make a lot of sense. And the biggest alarm bell for me was, if you mention AGP, welcome to getting blocked and getting pushed out and getting screamed at and everything. And it was like, they really fucking hate this. Why do they like, what is your,
They're kind of suspicious, right?
why do you think that is? Yeah, it's
Um,
real suspicious. It's almost like there is a fantasy narrative and this other thing is reality smacking them in the face and they have to run from it.
yeah, it's because they're really attached to that version of themselves, right? And so when they hear that those strong, meaningful feelings that, like, from the inside, they feel very beautiful and important. That when they hear that those feelings are because they're actually a heterosexual male and with a weird type of heterosexuality, it sort of directly contradicts the fantasy, the dream, the beloved self-image, and in a way that really hurts them emotionally. And so that's kind of what's happening. I mean, it's kind of like, if you were to like insult a man's wife in a social situation, like, that's not gonna fly, you know?
Right. So if we're looking at the kind of like the typical autoheterosexual, right? This is an individual that is attracted to women and is attracted to women in such a degree that it's no longer just I'm attracted to the idea outside of myself, but I'm also attracted to the idea within myself. I'm attracted to what it is that I perceive womanness to be, right? Because you're not experiencing genuine womanness to a degree because it is I don't want to say a caricature because then I'm borrowing too much from the TERFs there, right? But like it is an outside perspective. Right. And I think we all recognize that everyone has some level of balance between masculinity and femininity. The pure 100% masculine person is a toxic fucking weirdo with mental issues, and vice versa. The pure 100% feminine is a perpetual victim that can never stand up for themselves, is constantly utilizing lies and deceit to break other people down, and refuses to let go of their children and allow them to grow, and instead enables them with an overabundance of love, right? Like no human should ever be purely masculine or feminine. And so we all kind of have a level of femininity. And so what you're saying is that this trans person that's, let's say, in the cult, if you will, they've created a persona of a woman that they are. This is who they are. They are this person. And they love her and they love themselves in this kind of narcissistic relationship. And when you attack that person, they have made that person real. They have made that person who they are. And maybe what you're saying is a greater understanding of autoheterosexuality is understanding that that person's not real. Like, you're who you are. And into some ways you get to choose how you act and be in the world. And you are going to have some euphoria and some happiness and some things when you experience, behaviors and modalities of like who you want to be, and possibly even some sexual euphoria from being in, embodying something that you like and love so much. And that narcissistic love can be dangerous, sure, but it also isn't hurting anybody if you're not hurting anybody. But when you come around and you say, hey, that's a sexuality. That's not a real fucking person. You're not really Tanya. You're Thomas, and Thomas put on a dress, and Thomas got some surgeries, and Thomas goes by a new name now, and that's cool. Have at it, but you'll always be Thomas. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is that there's almost like an attack on who everything that they've built up by admitting it's a sexuality in some way, or am I missing something?
That's kind of like emotionally how it hits a lot of them, but like that's not necessarily what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But
okay, yeah,
like that. While yes, that cross-gender, like, you can't literally be the other sex, but like they can choose how much to make that cross-gender persona real. Whether it's for the autoandrophiles or the autogynephiles, they can choose, like, how much do I care about this version of myself, and what am I willing to do for it? and is it worth the trade-offs? You know, they can make these sort of like rational decisions.
Okay, but yeah. I mean, I guess I was trying to understand the controversy, right? Because
yeah,
you know,
it's because it conflicts with them.
yeah, you know, like when
really
they
attached
from
to
the
thing.
individual, yeah,
they're really attached to it. They love it. And you know, like I can't blame them. Like if like I experience the feelings from it sometimes, and like they're powerful. They really tug on the heartstrings, and yeah.
Well, I
So
also noticed there's
yeah.
a difference in reaction between the dolls and those that don't really pass that well, especially with the males, right? Like I don't see it so much with the females. The females kind of seem, at least from the outside, right? Like this purely anecdotal here, right? But it seems to me that those that pass well, when you just call them a man, or you call like or the autogynephilia is brought up, they kind of don't give a fuck. They kind of just laugh at you and go like, I'm hotter than your ugly ass wife anyways. And then they just move on. Whereas like those that are attached to it so deeply and like they, you know, there's a knowing in reality that they haven't been able to achieve that idealized self. I don't know. Do you see this as well?
Yeah, I kind of know what you're talking about. Like the ones that pass super well, like they're so confident. Like they're confident in their identities because, you know, no matter where they go in everyday life, people see them as the other sex, and so that's never put into doubt. And so, and also it seems like they don't have as much shame about it either. You know, because like, yeah, they look how they want, and they care about that a lot, and basically they have what they want. You know, whereas the ones that don't pass as well, there's sort of unmet desire and sort of a greater conflict between what they are and what they wish they were, and so that makes them suffer more.
Yeah, I know that we're getting into like this kind of weird territory of like, you know, oh, the hot ones are okay, but I think the reason that I wanted to mention this specifically is that like I do wonder if this typology is so much more necessary for those that have fought and fought and fought to make this fantasy a reality and can't. Right? And I guess what I mean by that is that there's someone at the end of the spectrum that gets, like you said, gets everything that they want, and so they just get to be Tanya. And it's like if you try and say, well, you're not really Tanya technically, they go, cool, I'm fucking Tanya to everyone you know anyways. Bye. Right? Whereas there are these other people that have fought, and you know what I mean? Like they've fought for Tanya to be real, but Tanya is still an internal thing that other people are only validating if they're terrified of like social ostracization, not because they see her.
Right. Yeah. It's and the real desire is for people to see her without having any pressure to do so, you know, just to like naturally see her.
Right.
And so yeah, I do think that some of the ones that tend to not pass as well, I would hope that if they hear this sort of autosexual theory, that they can realize, oh, that's what it is, and maybe sort of emotionally disinvest a little bit from the intensity of their love of that inner woman, just for preserving their own mental well-being.
Yeah. So I guess I question, you know, there's those, you know, how important in this is I guess sorry, I'm trying to formulate this so it makes sense, because we're on the cusp, right? Like we're at the chaotic edge where science tells us very little, and we're trying to understand something so complicated with so little research. But in your opinion, this need for validation from the outside, right? It appears to me that the typology that you presuppose allows for an individual to need less of that outside validation because there is an understanding of what the thing is, and wherever you are in engaging with that sexuality is something that you can be comfortable with because you know what it is. Whereas the ideological queer theory, trans rights movement, kind of collective narcissistic fucking cult, if you will, imposes validation on others because it needs that validation, because it needs others to tell them that they are the thing, or else it's the ideology that undergirds this starts to crumble. And so I wonder, just off of that statement, as I see it, what are your feelings about how I describe that landscape?
Like how the trans movement forces like the validation, like that part of it.
Well, how the individuals within the trans movement that have adopted this ideology need validation and then force validation on others as a movement, as a community, and kind of collectively get everyone to force others to get validation because they need it. And I wonder if that validation is much less needed if one understands it as a sexual orientation and as an internal thing.
Yeah. I think that like remains to be seen. I mean, personally, I would think it would help a little bit in terms of people, instead of thinking, oh, I have this super special sacred gender identity, they'd realize like, oh, I have this very strong attachment to this image of myself and I love it. And so I'm going to have strong feelings around it. But, I also can't expect people to see something that's not visible to their eyes. I would hope that the theory would help people be more realistic.
Yeah, for sure. So, there's one last question. It was on your questionnaire that you sent me like right before the interview. One last thing I want to ask, and then if there's anything you want to ask me. But I think we've gone over this fairly detailed. We didn't go into some of the more personal experiences.
We didn't go into
cool.
autoandrophilia very much, but that's the norm. People often don't ask about that very much.
That's super fair. What would I guess I think it's because the autoandrophiles, or I should say the assigned female at birth, right? The trans men are, despite being a larger cohort, are, for lack of a better word, less like men. Like they're less fucking demanding and screeching at you. And like, you know what I mean? Like when you're engaged online, when you're in this culture war, it's always some, the politicians that are at TRAs or like the big activists are all fucking competitive men in I guess, for, like turfs in woman face or whatever. Right. Like,
no, I get what
so
you're saying.
I guess they do kind of get ignored. Yeah. I guess that's how I see it. Like, what's apologies. Like, you're right. Like, what would you have to say that is so desperately missed about that aspect that's different?
I mean, mostly I just wanted to like mention again that they exist just because they get ignored so often, and but like they have
I see
their
no
own
research
special...
on it too, by the way.
Right, there's very little. Yeah, for the book, I had to look through all the formal research and find whatever scraps I could of like, once I understood sort of what it looked like, I could pick it out of various things where it wasn't necessarily called out by name usually, but I began to recognize how to see it. And yeah, you mentioned the like females being a little more fluid and less rigid, and I do see that with the autoandrophilic trans men, where they're less likely to have that super strong cross-gender identity, and they'll be more likely to be, say, like non-binary, or just be like, oh, I'm trans mask, like he, they, instead of like with the autogynephilic trans woman, it's like, I'm a woman and it is she, there's a difference in the intensity of and rigidity of the self-image. And But they also have their own set of
So
struggles with dating and stuff too, where
mm,
it's hard for them to date men and then still feel like a man in relation to them a lot of the times, and that's something they really want, is like a relationship.
yeah, I would say
between
men
equals.
men 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 tend to gatekeep maleness in a way that women don't. I would
Yeah,
say differently, right? Like not like women are catty and subversive in ways, but like men are like, you're either one of the boys or you're just fucking not. And like there's not a lot of conversation about it or sharing to go along with it. It's like you either get invited to the boys' functions or you fucking sit home alone wondering like why you don't have any friends. Like there's no kind of like there's no in between in the way that like male relationships kind of tend to work in that regard. And I wonder if that is a unique challenge for someone that hasn't grown up presenting as a man through, elementary school and middle school and things like that. It's something I saw. Like there was this really big viral video that I saw of like a trans man that was like, it's so lonely. And I was just like, yeah, welcome
real.
to being a dude. Like you wanted this, like, I'm sorry, it sucks for you, but like this is what being a dude. And then of course they were like, but of course all of your concerns are valid and white men are the worst. And I'm like, bitch, do you not see that you're like you're promulgating the very thing that makes this so much worse? But like whatever, like have fun, I guess. I don't know.
yeah, no, that's a thing. I think I saw that same video you're talking about, and I've seen quite a few
Yeah.
stories of trans men online where they transition and they just feel so lonely because like before, people cared about their well-being and had interest in them, and like women would have their guard down
Yes.
around them, but then like they go on T and then all of a sudden there's like a wall, and they don't know how hard it is that
Yeah.
maleness is much more of a winner take
Male
all
love is
thing.
conditional.
Yeah, and they also haven't been socialized into learning how to bust each other's balls and like how to take jokes, whereas like men can joke with each
True.
other, and like I think like a lot of trans men don't know how to do the busting each other's balls thing as a sign of male camaraderie, like because it's not like a language they were taught.
Well, it's like I don't have a ton of experience with trans men, right? But what I have noticed in my limited experience, is that like they're either uncomfortable, they just feel uncomfortable the whole time when it's just the boys, or they're like overcompensating. It's like it's not a natural kind of like fluid, like, guys say something because it's there and it's in the moment, and like it was like guys just pick low hanging fruit in conversation to bust each other's balls, like when it's there, but they don't force it, because then they're like, hey man, like why are you being a dick right now, right? Like there's a weird flow in like how you bust each other's balls, right? In that like
Yeah.
it's like you said something that someone's like, yo, pause, that was gay, right? And they're like, I didn't mean it like that, and then you move on. Yeah, I don't know. It is interesting to have my own hypocrisy kind of laid bare before me. It's like, hey man, we just did an hour and a half interview. We talked about autoandrophiles like twice. And it's like, oh fuck yeah. Like it's literally presented factually just by the course of the conversation. But it is it is. I don't know. I guess all of the D-trans people that I usually speak to are female because they're D-trans. And yet, yeah. and yet still somehow I ignore that aspect. It's
Well, a lot of the D-trans females
I
are
guess,
autoandrophilic. Like for instance, like there's an interview that Chloe
Mhm.
Cole did with Jordan Peterson, where a bit over an hour into it, she mentions that she during her transition she'd have sexual fantasies of being a male, and she referred to it by the name autoandrophilia.
Yeah, I remember when I spoke with her, there was certainly some of the sexual abuse that the hatred of her because breast tissue. So it's like there's so many layers to it, where it's like, oh, I'm not a psychologist, so good luck. Is that the trauma? Is it the androphilia? And then there's also kind of the ideas like I was saying before with the spectrum, is that something that's common? Is that common in, let's say, 10% of people? It takes a traumatic event or experience or something that exacerbates that as a self-defense mechanism, right? A means of coping with trauma that occurs. And of course, as soon as you say that it's based in trauma, every fucking conservative and TERF gets so happy because they're like, see, they want penises in women's prisons. It's like, no, I'm just trying to be honest about this,
Yeah, it is hard to say whether something is trauma or not, but I personally I haven't really been a fan of people using the word trauma lately because it's so vague, and it's like people are kind of just pulling stories out of their ass. And it's and also, say with like a detransitioner who, talked about having autoandrophilic fantasies and then has a story about like, oh, I had sexual trauma and that's why I did it. And it's like, well, actually, if you consider the orientation as well, like the orientation could explain why you cared so much about having those gender signifying body parts, whereas other people could have brushed it off, so that's part of why I brought up the autoandrophilia though, because and part of why I titled the book Autoheterosexual, because I wanted to include them as equals to male autogynephilia, because they've been ignored for a long time. And so I just think that the treatment of female gender dysphoria would be greatly improved if clinicians could understand, oh, hey, this patient is autoandrophilic, and then sort of ask them about, which aspects of gender they care about, and sort of figure out, hey, is medicalization the right approach?
Hey, real quick, I'm gonna hop out and hop right back in and reset an audio thing because my audio delay has gotten progressively worse.
I noticed that. Yeah.
So I'm on a bad audio sync. I'm gonna see if I can reset it real quick, but I'll be right back. And you can it shouldn't take but a second to see if I can fix it. It either works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, fuck it, it happens. But I'll be right back. All right, boys, give me just 1 second. We're going to maybe do that, put it in safe mode, see if that resets. Hold on 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. All right, so it's working. All right, enter. Come on. Enter. All right. Why is the background back on minimal? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I don't know.
And it's synced up now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I had to reset my audio for a second.
That was trippy to deal with that over the last hour.
Look. It happens sometimes, Look, it's I need a better computer. All right. I need a better computer. So I need a better CPU. It's something to do with StreamYards too. It does something weird to my fucking audio. I might start using a different program or something, but I really like StreamYards. So, but so getting back on without jacked up, audio delay. People were saying it was like watching a kung fu movie. One of the things that you said that was really important is, there are tests and self-report surveys and resources that people that are feeling dysphoric in some capacity or feel their sexuality, that this rings true in some capacity, that they can determine if they're autoheterosexuality. Where do people go for that?
Well, those tests haven't really been developed yet in terms of ones that clinicians use. That'd be a good thing to work on. And I've actually been thinking of what sort of questions would be on it, because there's various subjective phenomena when you have these autosexual orientations that are pretty specific to it, such as phantom anatomy, where say a lot of autoandrophiles will experience having a phantom dick, where they feel like they actually have one and it's there. And and it's particularly tends to be connected with sexual moments as well, you know. And there's also phenomenon called mental shifts. There's a concept created by Therians, which are people that identify as animals. Um, uh, they basically, a mental shift is when you have this sort of like shift in your mental state where you feel more like the thing it is that you're trying to embody. And like if you're an autogynephile, you'll feel a little more feminine. If you're autoandrophile, you'll feel more masculine, and maybe like strong and confident. Sort of like whatever like gender virtues you can think of associated with these things, you'll have sort of like that inner feeling of being that thing. And it tends to like wax and wane with, I think libido's a factor. At least with males, it's pretty clear cut to tell with the autogynephiles, because like as soon as like post nut clarity kicks in, like that mindset just like a lot of them snap out of it immediately. And
Snap
it's
shame.
quite, yeah, and it's quite jarring to them. And so yeah, there's these things like the phantom anatomy. I'd like to get some good questions about that, because for it, if someone says that they have the sensation of having like a phantom vagina or phantom breasts, like that's a pretty strange thing, like that's not normal. But it's like a known pattern with these orientations to have those sort of sensations. And so that could be like a good indirect indicator. Like other indirect indicators are like gender euphoria, like if they after cross-dressing notice like, hey, I'm getting goosebumps, or like I get like a noticeable salient mood boost after putting on clothes of the other sex, then that could be a good indicator of autoheterosexuality. Yeah, and there's also other indirect things, like if someone's like particularly attracted to trans women, or to trans men, like if a male has gender dysphoria,
chasers,
and yeah, but colloquially chasers. I don't like that term just because it's like it's usually used as kind of an epithet, and it's just a different type of sexual orientation, and it's highly correlated with autogynephilia anyways. So when trans women complain about chasers, I'm just like, yeah, well, you're one of them too. Like, come on.
It's so true. It's so true.
Yeah, it's like kind of hypocritical. So it's like, it's kind of rude to be like,
it's like you're going to call him a chaser and be mad, and then you're going to be egg emojiing them all day long. And then like then when they trans, they're going to become one of you, and then all of a sudden they're not problematic anymore because
right.
Why? Because they took some fucking drugs, like, and changed their body. Like, stop.
Yeah, treat chasers better, y'all. Have some respect.
I say this selfishly because I have no problems with like femboys or like with like attractive trans people, and people are like, what, bro? But like I'm not trying to secretly explore or find anything in myself. I don't know, man. I just like cute faces, and like I don't mind a penis. Like, I don't know what to tell you guys.
Yeah, no, and like the research suggests that is a type of heterosexuality in males. Because like when they got brought in, when chasers and cross-dressers got brought into the lab, basically they responded in ways that they were most attracted to women and trans women, and not really into men at all, which suggests that they are basically heterosexual, and that they're attracted to trans women. Their attraction to trans women is a byproduct of their heterosexuality. And
yeah, I mean, that tracks.
Yeah, and so yeah, there's these sort of like associated phenomenon that are highly correlated. That gynandromorphophilia, which is attraction to trans women. There's like the gender euphoria. There's the.
Can you say that 10 times fast?
I can, but you don't want me to. Yeah, but like yeah, there's like all these indirect signs that you could ask. Clinicians could ask patients about these things, and the patients wouldn't necessarily know that they're trying to like categorize you. you know, because and it doesn't seem like it's overtly about sexuality. You know, like if you ask about gender euphoria, and the patient talks about like experiences of gender euphoria and then sort of what caused it and what it felt like, then the clinician could like make a mental note of like, okay, this definitely sounds like the autoheterosexuality, and so that they could then work from that understanding and then sort of figure out which subtypes of the orientation they have itself, whether they like the clothes or whether they care about the interpersonal, like the social reinforcement.
Blanchard, I think was it Blanchard? I might be mistaken, but put forward like 4 types, right? Which is transvestic, which is clothing, behavioral, physiological, and then anatomical. Anatomical being kind of like the last category of like, I'm going to like literally get surgery to change my body.
Right. It's just about having and later research has found support for a 5th category of interpersonal, which is more of like, having other people see you a particular way. And that's also, as a part of that, there's also a thing called meta attraction, where you can be sexually attracted, like same sex attracted, but it's about reinforcing a cross gender persona rather than like direct attraction to the same sex form. Like,
wait, I'm sorry, I don't understand this one. I apologize.
Yeah, that was pretty heady. Basically, there's AGPs that like if you have meta attraction, it would be like you'd be down to have sex with a man as long as you play like a feminine sex role, and preferably like if they treat you like a woman, like you wouldn't be topping the man, that wouldn't be a thing. But if you bottom, like that's totally cool. And it's not really based on like a conventional direct attraction to the male form like homosexuality is. But it's basically another way of arriving at homosexual behavior.
Okay, so this is I mean it's kind of horseshoe theory of sexuality where it's so straight it's gay. But
exactly, yeah.
But what you're saying is you've become so sexually inclined towards the idea of the feminine aspect within oneself that you would be willing to engage in homosexual sex acts so long as they were not really homosexual, because you're so involved and also so affirmed in your femininity that it becomes almost reverse heterosexuality.
Yeah, it's
like getting dommed by some dude, but like you don't even like dudes, but you just like being in the submissive role.
But it's hot as hell. Like you don't even like dudes, but it's like the hottest thing ever, basically. And it understandably it's confusing to the people that experience it.
There's a conservative knee-jerk reaction in me when I hear shit like this, right? And it's like it's really difficult to bark down because like, I want to intellectualize and I want to be empathetic. And I also want to be like libertarian in the sense that like, I respect people's individual rights so long as they're doing things with consent. And yet, if I'm honest, right? Because I always try to be honest with my stream people. I try to do the best I can not to be a grifter and like just bullshit, right? There's another part of me, like a little cowboy masculine conservative, cowboy boots that are, painted like the American flag guy on my shoulder. That's like, this is a fuck ton of normalization of degeneracy. And like this person is borrowing terms from like otherkin and furries. And like, at what point does this train stop before we're just in a place where like the concept of gender isn't abolished? It's just so amorphous, and sexuality is so fluid with so many different names that we're in a place where nothing matters and it becomes a nihilistic, hedonistic, narcissistic indulgence of the self and degeneracy instead of like family and life and society and structure and order. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think regardless of what conservatives think or want, the people that experience these strong emotions are going to follow their heart. So not much they can do about it. I mean, they could fight over like how much we accept it culturally. But you're not going to stop people from doing these things. And, you know, as long as they're doing it with consenting adults, like, that's pretty good. So, yeah, I just think the conservatives that want like tradition and normalcy, like, in a technological society, that's just it, with technological process comes the breaking of those old traditional bonds, and it is alienating and scary. But it's unavoidable if we keep progressing technology. This sort of like progressive cultural changes are just an inevitable byproduct of it.
I agree and disagree. I mean, I agree with you so long as we have large nation states that force people of different cultural values to live together under the name of liberalism and multiculturalism, right? Like, I don't think the Amish have too hard of a time, right? Like living their life the way that they want to live their life while only be kind of mildly exposed to the degeneracy of the outside world when they go to like trade their like little fire pits. You know what I mean? So I think that there are alternatives. And you know, I'm an anarchist, right? Like, I'm a libertarian anarchist. I'm a little bit different than obviously the traditional person in this conversation. You know, I want a million Liechtenstein, right? And so like I want, you know, transgender Transylvania and, you know, the Amish to have their own spot too. And you know, whichever one does better, whatever makes you happy. But so long as it's, you know, not violating people's rights. But yeah, I kind of agree with you. So long as these large liberal democracies exist and don't fall from financial reasons or don't fall to Marxism and critical theory or to something else, yeah, you're probably going to live in an amorphous society where we're more and more connected, and that more and more connection means less and less control over kind of the societal acceptance of things that happen within your community, right? Like, your kid is on the internet with someone from Texas and New York and California and, you know, and Mumbai. The more connected he is with those people and the less concerned he is with the strict adherence to the cultural norms of the people that live in your fucking neighborhood.
Right, exactly. And so there's a homogenization of culture that comes with technological society that is, it's pretty incredible with how powerful it is. Like, I know that, like, my thinking on this is pretty strongly influenced by Jacques Ellul's work. He wrote The Technological Society, and he also wrote Propaganda: The Formation of Men's Attitudes. He was a Frenchie that he wrote about this technological problem and the homogenization and standardization of culture that comes with technological development. And I don't know a way out of it. You know, it is a problem for a lot of people. A lot of people want some culture, but like they want, you know, like there'll be conservatives that want their own culture with their traditions followed and such, but they also want medical care and computers that work. And you kind of, if you take the technology, it's hard to not have the cultural stuff come along with it.
Yeah, like I said, I agree. So long as you have nation states that impose multiculturalism and impose restrictions on people having their own culture, right? Like, you could look at Chiron, Mexico, for example, right? You know, this was a very poor region of Mexico that was constantly being polluted by corporations coming in and destroying their water with illegal logging and like paid off the Mexican government and cartels. They eventually got fed up and, like, believe it or not, a bunch of abuelas, a bunch of grandmas with machetes came into like the logging people and their security when they came in and kind of like rioted and took them over and like burned all their equipment and sent them out and established Chiron, which is an anarchist community. And so they have a very, very, very dominant, strict culture because they are an anarcho-indigenismo, right? They like follow like the old religion in terms of like some weird voodoo rock shit. But mostly they have a council of elders and stuff. So they have a very strong, cohesive culture. And yet they've gone from a poor, destitute place that was kind of fucked over all the time to developing factories where they use tree sap from the forest to build construction and concrete block materials. And they've planted over 3,000 hectares of forest in like the last decade, healing the woods, and they've tripled the GDP of the average person there. So I think it absolutely can be done, that you can impose culture within your community and catch up and gain in a technological era while importing goods. I just don't think it can be done when a government says your community that gatekeeps itself isn't allowed to not bring in immigrants or not allowed to not, you know what I mean? Like it is the government that's forcing these people together.
That place sounds like a pretty cool place to live, honestly. I mean,
you better speak Spanish. You better speak Spanish.
I do not. Yeah.
Then they ain't gonna let you in. They gatekeep pretty hard. They'll let you come visit, but like you have to like prove that you're one of them. And they've also gotten rid of violent crime for the most part. Partly because if there is a violent criminal, which is very rare, they just send them to Mexico. They're like, cool, fuck you. They get banished and then they end up in a Mexican prisoner cartel. But the other reason is when they find like young delinquents, the young delinquents go essentially on tour with their police and they give them guns. The problem kids, they give them guns and have them like go with the police and empower them to like protect their borders from like poachers and shit. And then they go to the Council of Elders and basically have psychotherapy. And like they've completely gotten rid of almost every form of violent crime because of this. Identify the problem early and then have the elders of the community. It's a pretty cool place. You should check out documentaries on Chiron, Mexico. It's pretty dope. It's leftist too. It's like a mutualist kind of place. You know, not my perfect place, but still pretty dope.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No.
I don't know.
I love freedom. So. Yeah. Cool.
I don't know that they would like somebody like you though. They're probably pretty conservative.
I'm not saying I'm trying to go there, but like it's always nice to like learn about other ways of living to see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. So I mean, but I do kind of agree with you. You know, it's a weird tangent. I like talking about Chiron sometimes, but yeah, I do think that we are kind of in a situation where so long as we're very connected and we don't have small gate-kept communities, and we don't have that capacity, then yeah, we're going to see a whole slew of hedonistic, degenerate things that people aren't going to have a lot of control over. And the conservative in me doesn't like that. You know, I don't want that. I really don't. I don't want acceptance of furries. You know, like, not to say like, be a furry all you fucking want. I just don't want to hang out with you, and I don't want any business to do with you, and I don't want you anywhere. I certainly don't want you near my kids when you're switching between foxkin and human. Not because I think you're a pedo or anything, but you're weird, and I tend to keep weird people away from my kids, you know?
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I do think that, like, with furries, it's an interesting thing where, you know, it's a species-based attraction. And, you know, a lot of them have personas that are kind of like a species version of the gender stuff we were talking about.
Yeah.
And, you know, and they also have elevated rates of transgenderism in that subculture. Basically, yeah, it's when someone does have a, you know, paraphilic sexual orientations, there tends to be like other things that are weird about them. But like, you know, just like when you think on just statistical group level, but when it comes to individuals, there's also like, there's probably like furries that are like upstanding citizens and more ethical than like some people that are just completely heterosexual normies.
For sure. Like, for sure. I mean, so there's a thing here with paraphilia, right? Paraphilia is an arbitrary distinction that basically states whether or not it's functional, right? I mean, like something becomes a sexual disorder not because it's different or atypical. It becomes paraphilic because it is problematic in some capacity towards you engaging with society or you going on with your daily life, right? So, you know, the sex addict is, you know, go ahead.
That's not a paraphilia is just any sexual interest outside of um, conventional sexual attraction to a physically mature adult. Um, Basically, anything outside of what we call vanilla is paraphilia.
I
And
okay. Where okay, I take issue with that. Right, I legitimately take issue with that. Some definitions would say that, yes, but you wouldn't have a paraphilic disorder because you have foot fetish. You wouldn't diagnose that person with a paraphilic disorder. You might call it paraphilia, right? But it wouldn't be a diagnosable thing because it's not a problem.
right, you're talking about paraphilic disorders?
Yes, I apologize when I'm trying to talk about what is and isn't a paraphilic disorder. Like, yes, a foot fetish is a paraphilia, but like the word really doesn't have any utility in that sense. Like, it's kind of a meaningless word.
So paraphilia is, it's a paraphilic disorder when it causes a certain degree of distress to your life or impedes and causes distress on the life of others. But like but if there's no distress, then it's still paraphilia, but not a paraphilic disorder.
Right. And so what I guess what I mean to say is that like a certain level of normalization gets rid of one of those aspects. Right? So for furries, for example, 20 years ago, if you were a furry and you tried to be a wolfkin, that's going to impede your ability to like move about the world. Pretty hardcore. Right?
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But like now you can go to a hotel festival and you can crinkle, to the point where, and you know what I mean? And like be as degenerate and crazy as you want. And like, you might get made fun of on the internet some, but like, it's not going to stop you from going on to what is it? Fet Life?
Yes, Fet Life.
Fet Life. Yeah. Sorry. It's been a while. You know what I mean? And finding somebody else and, doing whatever it is that you do. Right. So I guess what I mean to say is that like, there is a certain understanding that the more we normalize paraphilias in general, like there's certainly going to be a slippery slope towards other disorders being normalized. And like, I guess that's not really a problem if, to me personally, if I'm not harmed by it. But it might be a problem to society and to those people if those things are viewed as normal and healthy, but really aren't, right? Like they really put forward all of these barriers towards their ability to have meaningful lives.
Yeah. It's a tough, the way I think about this issue of how to, like, what do we do culturally about this is like, I think for each specific type of sexuality, we have to hammer out as a culture, like, what are the acceptable ways of acting upon it and what are the unacceptable ways, because each specific sexual interest will have its own particular facts about it. And so it kind of requires a pretty decent amount of like sexual literacy to like begin to even have the sort of like ethical conversations around like what is, like what are the appropriate bounds. Like it wouldn't be cool for like a furry, for instance, if they're like, hey, I'm gonna go mark my territory like in the corner of your room, but like them wearing a little foxtail or whatever doesn't conceivably harm anyone.
Right.
Yeah, so it's about like how they act on it is sort of how I think of this question.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's kind of one of those situations where sexuality seems to be something that is really integral to how a society functions. The roles, gender roles, again, feminists, fuck off, of both varieties, both TERFs and TRAs. Gender roles are an important part of a society. And the roles around sex and courtship are also and how families are formed seem to be really, really important. And so it kind of seems like there is a conservative impulse in all of us, maybe, to that might be good, which is to be really careful about how we play with those things. You know, because
Right, like about how much value and energy you put into them. Like
yeah,
should basically like there's sort of the question like should we privilege heterosexuality as a special orientation and that it deserves to be treated as arguably the most important sexual orientation because it's what makes our society reproduce itself.
yeah. I mean, I also there's this weird thing too where liberalism, libertarianism, and the kind of the emotional idea of liberalism has formulated this idea that acceptance and morally and not morally unjustified have become the same thing, right? Which is to say, you know, I have absolutely no right to go to a furry convention, right? And use the police to stop them from doing it. Or like use anything to stop them, right? Like they're free fucking grown adults. They can do whatever the hell they want to do. And yet there's this weird impulse in our modern society where that idea means I should accept it. And it's like, I don't know that necessarily means that I should accept it or that I shouldn't, or that those people shouldn't be ostracized in some way. There's a certain part of me that feels that it is likely healthy that, I don't know, it's hypothetical, right? That there's a certain healthy function to being like, furries are fucking weirdos, go in your corner with your people, right? And not having it just be like, but they're furry, you have to be a furry. Like, no, Jonathan doesn't get to bring his cat ears to the fucking dinner table at Thanksgiving. Like, go take that shit elsewhere. You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, I think Jonathan should be able to wear his ears if it makes him happy. But, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, there's always the question of like when you're designing a culture, so to speak,
right.
like how do you want to design it? And yeah, but like with these anomalous sexual interests, I mean, as far as I can tell, a lot of it is mostly inborn. Like the amount of like weird porn we have access to might make people figure out what they're into a little earlier in life. But I don't think that people's sexuality has fundamentally changed too much.
Yeah, I mean, there's a weird rose. One thing that I have noticed with the openness is conservatives seem to have this idea that like homosexuality and all forms of other sexuality was this incredibly super rare thing in history that like totally never happened, except for very, very rarely, right? And it's like to a certain degree, they're right, and the TRAs and like this worrying new trend of everybody identifying with everything is wrong, right? Like the truth has to be somewhere in between, because in California, like 40% of all Gen Z identify as LGBT. That's clearly not true, right? Like,
right? Yeah, that's not how human sexual orientation is. I don't think.
Right.
Yeah.
We would not exist as a species when you look at the birth rates and how many people died in childbirth. If 40% of people weren't fucking the other gender exclusively and trying to get them pregnant, right? Like, it's just like we wouldn't have made it here if that was how human sexuality is. And so there's kind of two options, which is that either one, there always was some hidden repressed sexuality that we don't need to have as repressed in our current society. That's one explanation, but it's not the full explanation. The other explanation has to be one of two things. Either that people are lying because there's political clout and an ideological pride and joy and cult-like behavior in progressive politics where people lie and really they're not bi. They kissed a girl once, but at the end of the day, they're fucking straight.
Yeah, I think the B is being inflated right now where, you see those high identification rates, and I think it's mostly among bisexuals because, they'll think like, oh, I've been like sometimes attracted
non-binary
to someone. Right, yeah. And non-binary has a very low barrier to entry. You just say you're the thing and then you're the thing. It's not like transsexualism, which takes like a serious medical intervention. So,
But I think on the flip side
yeah.
though, there is something to be said that sexuality is moved by environmental factors. And I do think that we need to recognize that an openness to porn, I mean, like, porn is super not healthy. And it is clearly making, especially young boys, sexually aggressive in a lot of ways and explore sexualities that at a degree that I'm not sure they ever would have or necessarily was innately there if they had never consumed copious amounts of porn. I do think that there is a push from access to certain things that is moving sexuality, at least to some degree.
Yeah, no, I'd say you're right that it definitely has an influence on how people like express their sexuality and what sort of like methods or behaviors during the act that they're into. I think though that like the default, like the target based sexuality of like what is the sort of love object that you're drawn to, whether it's particular gender or like race or species or whatever. Like I think that is largely due to inborn factors.
Mm.
But yeah, no, I've definitely noticed that porn has gotten it's it's very debaucherous and degrading. And so it's just it's so much more hardcore than like like the sort of centerfolds you'd find in like woods porn. When I was growing up, like there like you had to like try to hope to download a JPEG quick enough on the family computer in the living room, and that the computer
Right.
wouldn't freeze when the parents walked in, or like you found like VHS tapes sitting around or like magazines that people hid in the woods somewhere, like
Yeah,
and
pretty
all this
much.
stuff was super tame compared to what's on the internet now.
I think
The,
that has an effect.
yeah,
Yeah. It
yeah, no,
has
and
to.
yeah, no, I think it does have an effect. It's just like, how do you stop it? Like if it's getting people off, they're going to keep looking at it. And if the algorithm keeps suggesting it to them, they're going to keep getting introduced to new things.
Right. I mean, I wonder if there is something important about the fluidity of sexual orientation in general. I mean, from a standpoint of passing on your genetic traits, we assume that it is that the fluidity of there's only kind of two options from an evolutionary psychology standpoint of these things if they're highly heritable, right? Option one is they've never been challenged, therefore the genes are just kind of there because they've never been put in a situation where they would be problematic, right? And option two is that they're beneficial in some capacity, right? Like when it dominates the entire human species, it kind of tends to be one of these two. So I would argue that these things have been challenged before, right? In Rome, in certain long, stable empires that have kind of gone into sexual acceptance and degeneracy. Like there have been many empires that have done such. So these have been, and these fluid sexual genetics haven't necessarily fallen away. And so I wonder if that means that there is some genetic benefit to the idea that when a society becomes super degenerate, then the fluidity of the sexuality kind of tames and calms the production of new people within the society. You know what I mean? Like it almost seems like that could be. I'm totally spitballing. It's late. I don't know where I'm at right now. Who even am I? But you kind of get what I'm saying. Like I do wonder if that is a positive for us. Kind of like how you mentioned before. You said, well, if you just let these people trans, eventually will it go away? Like because they're all making themselves infertile.
It should reduce in frequency in the population, if it's genetic. Like it's the logical consequence. So it's like if the trans movement got their way and people could just transition super quick, they'd kind of like eliminate themselves over time.
Right. But if it's something that's passed on from everybody, right, then that might not necessarily be true. But what might be true is that if a society divulges into degeneracy, that means that they are likely a society that has reached kind of peak expansion, right? Like this is no longer a warrior tribe. This is no longer a tribe that is trying to grow. Instead, it's isolated in some capacity. And so it's almost like at an end of a cycle of itself, right? And so I wonder if these sexualities then kind of blossom in cultures that have stagnated and kind of are just consuming without producing or attacking or growing or exploring. And that is kind of almost a human defense system, that the culture that stagnates stops producing, literally producing offspring.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to say because the thing that's happening now with technology blasting off at exponential rates, it's historically unprecedented. It's so, yeah, I have no idea what's going to happen.
I got super fucking weird, and because it's towards the end, and I asked you a ton of questions. Is there anything that you wanted to ask me, or anything that you were curious about from my perspective as like a hardcore libertarian in the way that I view these things? Because you're kind of the subject matter expert here. I'm just kind of bouncing ideas off of you in terms of understanding this new typology. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm unsure about libertarian questions. I know I got really into listening to some libertarian podcasts like 6 or 7 years ago. I remember I used to listen to like the School Sucks one, and like Thaddeus Russell's.
It's okay, you can say it. He's a postmodernist, not really a fucking libertarian, but fair enough.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, that's part of why I stopped listening, because postmodernism is complete horseshit. Because, yeah, if someone doesn't believe that objective truth exists, it's like, well, then why would I care what you think? You know, it's always that's just your opinion, man. You know.
So it's like when sometimes I'll talk to commies and I'll be like, okay, but do you believe in logic, like the law of identity, law of excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction? And they're like, well, I mean, even just, I maybe, but like logic might not even. I'm like, why the fuck are we talking? Like, if you won't like affirm logic, like just basic Aristotelian logic, and like we're gonna play word games whether or not you believe in logical truth, then this is all performance, right? Like this is all just gobbledygook. Like you nothing you say you mean anyways.
Right. Yeah. No, I have that issue with people that don't have strong epistemic inclinations. It's like, why am I even bothering talking to you if you don't even believe that objective truth exists? And when I come across people like that, I find it fun to ask them questions like, is it objectively true that the sun exists? And then that usually trips them up a bit.
Yeah. You're very nice. You sound like a very nice person, because I'm way meaner when I come across those people.
Well, I
usually just push to like rape analogies,
too.
And that usually is the one where they're like, how dare you? I'm like, well, you don't even believe in objective truth. So like, what is consent? Like, and like, what are these things? Like, do you have a right to your body? Okay, well, why? Where do you derive that from? And then I usually just go to like shock and rage.
Right, which works in terms of online engagement, but like in terms of like convincing people, I find that like being non-aggressive is the most effective way to get them to change their mind.
Yeah.
And are you familiar with street epistemology?
What is street epistemology?
It's like this online subculture of basically, Peter Boghossian coined the term, and there's this online subculture of people that practice modern Socratic questioning, and it's basically just Socrates, but very updated to incorporate all the latest in techniques. And you just ask people questions about how they know what they know to see if they have good reason, if their reasons for believing it are good reasons. and you can get people to, like, it's very non-confrontational. You're just trying to understand why they believe what they do, and so they don't feel attacked because you're just trying to understand them. And it it's the sort of thing where it might not make good online content in terms of like getting people emotionally aroused and
Hmm.
angered, but like it sort of, it makes them ask themselves questions that like, it works beyond just that interaction. Like then they're wondering like for days and weeks to come, like they're thinking through those questions, and it like helps them deconstruct false beliefs over time.
Yeah, I mean, like the Socratic method works great when you want to elucidate cognitive dissonance, right? Where you're believing two things that, if you follow the logic through, you'll realize that you kind of can't believe both of these things at the same time. Great for
Yeah.
that. Um, Got to be careful with it because eventually you go back far enough to where people's brain just breaks, you know? Unless you're talking to an objectivist, right? Because you can get them all the way down to existence exists, A equals A, and then we will move from there. Like the objectivists can go all the way to the back. But there's very few people that have a really, really, really strong epistemology and like metaphysics, like framework.
Yeah, they're full of contradictions and just things driven by feeling because they haven't been challenged on it or really tried to drive down to the root of like what is truth and things like that. And like when I
Yeah.
was learning about this sexual orientation stuff, I had to go down to that level because everyone was telling me that I was wrong, and that like, science was wrong about this, and that you couldn't, and this is subjective human stuff. You can't objectively know what people are experiencing on the inside.
Mm.
And so had to get to the point where it's like, okay, what is truth? How
Yeah.
do we come to arrive at truth? And so I did go down to those fundamentals, and I came out of that with a pretty robust, much stronger understanding of epistemology than I had before, and it's been helpful. Um, yeah, it's yeah, I think truth is real, and that science is the like least bad way
Haber,
of arriving at it.
Habermas created, this is something we actually love within libertarianism because we believe in argumentation ethics. And this is one of the foundations of argumentation ethics, which is how we actually derive from logic the non-aggression in our, as objective fact, not getting into that. But Habermas defeated kind of the postmodern idea by critiquing, I believe it was Derrida, but it could have been Foucault or any of the fuckers. It's not important. He created the performative contradiction as a means of saying a person states, there is no such thing as objective reality or objective truth, right? And the thing is that, well, must assume that you believe that that statement is objectively true. And if you believe that that statement is objectively true, then you are saying that something is both true and false at the exact same time. So either what you're saying is either you don't believe that the statement you're saying is objectively true, and therefore this is a joke. This isn't a real statement of fact or belief. This is just you saying something silly or a performance for the king, right? So this is a performative contradiction, or you are just objectively wrong because something cannot be true and not true at the same time.
Yeah, it's self-refuting basically. That
Yeah.
sort of, you claim that there's not objective truth. It's like, okay, dude, then like, why am I listening to you then?
Are you joking? Are you telling me a joke right now? Or do you believe something can be both P and not P? Like something can be, A and not A. Like this is both a cup and not a cup. Like, no. Oh my God. Sorry. My brain just went to what are they called? Like, oh my God. Like something sent defend. I can't remember.
Deontology?
No, the types of logical sentences that like presumably defeat this by being like, I'm standing in the hallway and I'm standing in the room. My brain's done. I love you, Phil Illy. We should chat sometime about other topics. I don't know. Everyone, please, where can they find your book? Where can they find more about you?
Yeah.
And why is it so important? One last spiel.
Oh yeah, just a couple minutes. Yeah, it's so my book is called Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex. It looks like this. It's thick. Um, Big words, big font, so it's you can flip pages quickly and it's not like upsetting how slow it is. And it's important because it explains the most common cause of gender dysphoria. And if gender dysphoria is a serious problem that we want to address, then we must understand what is causing it in the first place. And yeah, which it sounds very straightforward when I say it, but people are not really down. Like, a lot of trans activists are not down with that. And it's like, well, look, if you actually care about solving the problem of gender dysphoria, you have to understand it first. And that's what my book does. It explains the most common kind of transness. The vast majority of trans people in the US are this type. They're not the homosexual type. And it also, because people get caught up on the whole, like, was Blanchard right about autogynephilia, yada yada. Like, I have chapters on transableism, transageism, trans species, and trans race. There was no data on trans race, so I collected some preliminary data to find support for the idea that there's an autosexual version of race-based attraction that leads to transracialism. And so basically, there's like all these different types of transness, and they all have the same sort of general structure of you're attracted to being a thing, you want to be the thing, the inability to be the thing causes suffering, and you feel better when you're more like the thing that you love. And so you embody the thing you love so that you can be happier and live a more meaningful life. And so that's basically what the book is about. It's not about ethics. I'm trying to answer what is instead of what ought. I think we have to address is first, and then after that we can figure out ought. But first we must know what is real. So that's
Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna probably get a Kindle copy when I get some time, because it's also on Kindle, so you can get a cheaper version, boys. If you're, I'm just saying, this is the internet, not like,
yeah. No,
when are you gonna do it? Are you thinking about doing an audiobook version?
Or are you asking me that, and it's like I haven't looked into how to actually produce that on your own, because I don't have the money to pay a studio to do that, so I have to figure out if it's feasible to do it on my own. But that would be good because most people like that, and also when you actually have your voice in someone else's ear, it has more influence in terms of parasocial influence.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see it being strategic to do that. So I should do it. It's on my to-do list, so to speak, but I don't know when that's going to happen.
And it's just Phil Illy on Twitter, correct?
Oh yeah. On Twitter, is my handle on there is autogynephilic. Twitter.com/autogynephilic. And on Substack, it's phililly.substack.com. Or you could go to autoheterosexual.com. It'll redirect there. I have put up a bunch of chapters for free on my Substack, so people can sample it before buying it to see, if they think it's relevant or good. Because I wrote it not to make money, but to spread the ideas. So that's why I'm putting it out there. Because money's nice, but it's more important for people to understand this so that we can help reduce suffering.
No, for sure. I really appreciate this conversation. It's like I said, conversations like these especially are kind of like they're at the edge of what we know. And so it's refreshing to have people that are willing to converse about it, because that's the most important, right? Like those are the most important things. I think that's why society reveres artists so much, is because they're communicating things at the bounds of what we know and trying to come back to us. And in this culture war, it is so insane that something has taken up so much of our politics, because it has become the battleground for critical theory and its instantiations like queer theory, etc.
Yeah, and critical theory is trash, and so I want to replace it. I prefer liberal theory, but yeah, that, like, your point about it taking up too much of our political bandwidth is like, that's another reason I want to get this theory out there, because when we're arguing about trans stuff, we're not arguing about like much more important stuff. Like, this is a small percent of the population.
Mm.
It should not take up nearly as much of the public's attention as it currently does. It's a waste of energy to be doing such.
Well, are you familiar with Prison Papers and Antonio Gramsci?
Right, yeah, like he's about seizing the cultural memes of production.
Sure, yeah. You get it. Like, this is the current fight to either maintain the cultural hegemonic institution of family and gender, or to have it overtaken by critical theorists. So it's super important to fight back against it, and it's super important for them to take it over. But all of this is enabled by poor data and poor understanding of the situation. And that's probably the best weapon, not the conservative reaction to this bad information to dig your heels in the sand and maintain the status quo, but to be able to accurately say, cool, but here's what's actually happening, and here's the data, and here's the truth. The truth is always so much more powerful.
Right. I think this is like, as you know, as friendly and benign as I am in terms of interpersonal interactions, this theory and the whole bundle of ideas associated with it are a very real threat to gender ideology, because they can replace it. And so that's why it's really important for people to know this. Like, if you are a person that loathes gender ideology and critical theory, and you want it to be replaced, this theory can do that. It can reduce, it can replace the gender and sexuality contingent of critical theory.
Well, for sure. It was really nice meeting you. I'm super happy we had this conversation. Fascinating talk.
On,
yeah, more often than not, when I talk about these issues, it's an interview that is dealing with someone that lived it, and we're trying to understand and pull out their story. Or I'm talking at a very baseline level about stuff, and like you are so knowledgeable in this one area that I feel like we were able to talk about things, like I said, again, like at the edges. So I really look forward to seeing your success, and hopefully your ideas and many others being promulgated further instead of simply castigated. Yeah. So good luck in your crusade for truth. I appreciate it. And people should check out the book. All right. Someone said you'll be in Rogan in a year. We'll see.
If anyone knows how to get me in contact with him, the booking guy, fucking make that happen. I'm trying to get on there.
Yeah, you let me know afterwards too, by the way. All right. Have a good one.